The autumn sun was setting over Pine Valley, casting long shadows across the well-maintained streets of the state capital's most prestigious neighborhood. Officer James Miller sat in his police cruiser, his eyes scanning the peaceful surroundings like a hawk watching for prey. At 45 years old, Miller had spent 20 years on the force, and he took pride in what he called keeping the right people in the right places. The dashboard clock showed 6:30 p.m. when Miller noticed an elderly black man walking slowly along Cedar Avenue, just a block away from the governor's mansion. The man wore faded blue jeans, an old brown sweater, and worn-out sneakers. He moved with careful steps, occasionally stopping to look at the beautiful houses that lined the street. Miller's jaw tightened. In his mind, something wasn't right. This neighborhood was home to doctors, lawyers, and politicians, people who dressed in expensive suits and drove luxury cars. The old man clearly didn't fit that image. "Dispatch, this is Unit 247, Miller spoke into his radio. "I'm conducting a suspicious person check on Cedar Avenue, near the governor's residence." "Copy that, Unit 247, the dispatcher responded. Miller pulled his cruiser to the curb and watched the man through his side mirror. The elderly gentleman had stopped again, this time studying the architectural details of a Victorian-style mansion. His hands were in his sweater pockets, and he seemed lost in thought. To most people, it would have looked like an innocent moment, a person simply admiring beautiful homes on a pleasant evening. But Officer Miller had already made up his mind. 20 years of what he called street experience had taught him to trust his instincts, even though those instincts had led to numerous civilian complaints, particularly from minority residents. Miller stepped out of his vehicle, adjusting his utility belt with practiced authority. The leather creaked as he moved, and his hand rested casually near his weapon, a habit he had developed over the years. The sound of his boots on the sidewalk was sharp and deliberate. "Sir," Miller called out, his voice carrying the kind of authority that expected immediate compliance. "I need you to turn around slowly and keep your hands where I can see them." The elderly man turned, his movements unhurried and dignified. His face showed no fear, just a mild curiosity mixed with what appeared to be tired resignation. He was probably in his late 60s, with silver-gray hair and intelligent eyes that held decades of wisdom and experience. "Is there a problem, officer?" the man asked calmly, his voice cultured and steady. He kept his hands visible but made no move to raise them, maintaining his composure and dignity. Miller's eyes narrowed. The man's calm demeanor and articulate speech didn't match his shabby appearance, which only made the officer more suspicious. "We've had reports of suspicious activity in the area," Miller lied, a tactic he often used to justify his stops. "What are you doing in this neighborhood?" "I'm taking an evening walk," the man replied simply. "I wasn't aware that was suspicious activity." Something about the man's composed response irritated Miller. Most people showed nervousness or fear when he questioned them, but this old man seemed almost amused. The officer stepped closer, his posture becoming more aggressive. "I'm going to need to see some identification," Miller demanded, his hand still hovering near his weapon. Several residents had begun to notice the confrontation, with a few stopping to watch from their porches or through their windows. The elderly man sighed softly, but his eyes held a strange glimmer, as if he had seen this scenario play out countless times before, but perhaps never from this particular angle. "Officer," he began, his voice steady and clear in the evening air, "I'd like you to think carefully about what you're doing right now." Miller felt his face grow hot with anger. In his mind, this was a clear challenge to his authority, and he wouldn't stand for it. He reached for his handcuffs, unaware that this routine stop was about to become one of the most significant moments of his career, and not in the way he expected. The tension in the air grew thicker as Officer Miller pulled out his handcuffs. The metal clicked ominously in the quiet evening, drawing more attention from nearby residents. A young woman across the street had already taken out her phone and started recording, while others watched nervously from behind their curtains. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back," Miller ordered, his voice getting louder with each word. The elderly man remained perfectly still, his calm demeanor only serving to irritate the officer further. "Officer Miller," the old man said, glancing at the nameplate on the officer's uniform, "I haven't committed any crime. You haven't even told me what suspicious activity I'm supposedly involved in. I suggest you radio your supervisor." Miller's face reddened. How did this man dare to tell him how to do his job? In all his years on the force, he had developed a certain way of handling what he called difficult situations. He reached for his radio, but not to call a supervisor. Dispatch, requesting backup on Cedar Avenue. Subject is being uncooperative. Miller barked into his radio. He then turned back to the elderly man. Last warning. Turn around now, or I'll have to use force. More phones appeared in windows and on porches. The evening light caught their screens as they recorded everything. A middle-aged woman in a business suit stepped out of her house, looking concerned. "Officer, is this really necessary?" she called out. "This gentleman walks through our neighborhood all the time. He's never caused any trouble." Miller ignored her, his attention fixed on the old man who still hadn't moved. With quick steps, he moved behind him and grabbed his arms, roughly pulling them behind his back. The elderly man didn't resist, but he didn't help either, maintaining his dignity even as the cold metal of the handcuffs closed around his wrists. "You're making a serious mistake, Officer Miller," the man said quietly, wincing slightly at the tight grip on his arms. "One that will have consequences far beyond what you imagine." 2 more patrol cars arrived with their lights flashing, bathing the scene in alternating red and blue. Officer Sarah Chen, a rookie who had just completed her training, stepped out of one vehicle. Her eyes widened as she recognized the man in handcuffs. "Oh my God," she whispered, then quickly spoke into her radio. "Dispatch, get the chief on the line immediately. Code Priority 1. Miller looked at Chen with annoyance. "This is my stop, Officer Chen. I got it under control." Chen rushed forward, her face pale. "Officer Miller, you need to remove those cuffs right now. Do you have any idea who this is?" The elderly man turned slightly, giving Officer Chen a small, knowing smile. "Good evening, Sarah. How's your mother doing? Did she recover well from her surgery last month?" Chen's voice trembled as she responded, "Yes, sir, she's doing much better. Thank you for sending those flowers to the hospital, Governor Thompson." The word governor hit Miller like a physical blow. His hands, which had been firmly gripping the elderly man's arms, suddenly went slack. The crowd that had gathered grew larger, and the whispers turned into loud murmurs of shock and outrage. "Gee, Governor?" Miller stammered, his confidence evaporating like morning dew under a hot sun. He looked down at his hands, still holding the handcuffs that bound the state's highest-ranking official. Governor Robert Thompson stood quietly, still handcuffed, making no move to change his situation. "Officer Miller," he said, his voice carrying clearly to the growing crowd, "I believe this presents us with what educators call a teachable moment. But first, I'd appreciate it if you'd remove these cuffs. They're rather uncomfortable." More police cars were arriving now, along with black SUVs that typically accompanied the governor's security detail. Miller's hands shook as he reached for the handcuff keys, knowing that in just a few minutes, this incident would explode across social media and news channels throughout the state. What he didn't know was that Governor Thompson had already decided how this story would end, and it wasn't going to be the way anyone expected. The next few minutes on Cedar Avenue felt like a scene from a movie. Police cars and black government SUVs lined the street, their emergency lights painting the elegant homes in alternating colors. Officer Miller's hands trembled as he removed the handcuffs from Governor Thompson's wrists, leaving behind slight red marks that made the officer's stomach turn. Police Chief Richard Martinez arrived at the scene, practically jumping out of his car before it fully stopped. His face showed a mix of horror and disbelief as he rushed toward the governor. "Sir, I can't begin to apologize enough for this incident," he said, shooting a fierce look at Officer Miller. But Governor Thompson raised his hand calmly, stopping the chief mid-sentence. "Actually, Chief Martinez, I don't want an apology right now." He rubbed his wrists gently and looked around at the gathering crowd. News vans were starting to arrive, their satellite dishes extending toward the darkening sky. "What I want," the governor continued, his voice steady and clear, "is for Officer Miller's body camera footage to be preserved. Every second of it. And I want the dash cam footage too." He turned to face the growing number of reporters who were setting up their cameras. "In fact, I want all the videos from these good citizens who recorded the incident." Miller stood frozen, his face pale and sweaty. His mind raced through all the possible ways this would end. Termination, lawsuits, public shame. His career, 20 years of service, all destroyed because he had let his prejudices guide his actions. The governor's security detail, led by Agent Marcus Johnson, approached with concern. "Sir, we should get you to a secure location," Johnson said, eyeing the growing crowd. "No, Marcus," Governor Thompson replied firmly. "I'm exactly where I need to be right now." He straightened his old sweater and turned to address the reporters who were now pushing microphones toward him. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying the same authority it did in the state capitol. "Despite his casual clothes, what happened here tonight is not unique. It's not special. The only difference is that it happened to someone you recognize." The crowd grew silent, hanging on every word. Even Officer Miller found himself listening intently, his shame mixing with unexpected curiosity. "Every day in our state, in our country, people who look like me face similar treatment," Thompson continued. "They're stopped without cause, questioned without reason, and treated with suspicion simply because of their appearance or the color of their skin. The only difference is they don't have the protection of a governor's title." He walked over to Officer Miller, who looked like he wanted to disappear into the ground. But instead of anger, the governor's face showed something unexpected, determination mixed with hope. "Officer Miller," Thompson said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "tomorrow morning at 9 a.m., I want you in my office. Not for punishment, but for a conversation. A real conversation about why you saw an old black man in casual clothes and immediately assumed criminal intent." The reporters' cameras clicked rapidly, capturing every moment. Officer Chen watched from nearby, her rookie optimism strengthened by the governor's approach to the situation. Chief Martinez stood quietly, recognizing that he was witnessing something more important than a simple disciplinary issue. "And to every citizen watching this," the governor went on, "I want you to know that tomorrow I'm not going to be wearing a suit. I'll be in these same clothes, this same old sweater, because the respect I deserve, the respect every citizen deserves, has nothing to do with their clothes, their appearance, or their skin color." As night fell on Cedar Avenue, Governor Thompson finally allowed his security detail to escort him home. But before leaving, he turned one last time to Officer Miller. "Remember, 9 a.m. tomorrow. This isn't the end of your career, Officer Miller. If you're willing, it could be the beginning of something much more important." The news crews immediately swarmed around Miller, but for once in his career, he had nothing to say. His mind was already on tomorrow's meeting, wondering how a routine patrol had turned into what might be the most important conversation of his life. Officer James Miller arrived at the state capitol building at 8:45 a.m. the next morning. He hadn't slept much, spending most of the night watching news coverage of the incident and reading hundreds of angry social media comments. His phone had been ringing non-stop with calls from reporters, but he hadn't answered any of them. The Capitol building looked more intimidating than ever as he climbed the stone steps. He was wearing his police uniform, freshly pressed, though he wasn't sure if he would still have the right to wear it after today. Security guards at the entrance gave him cold looks as they checked his ID, clearly recognizing him from the news. "Follow me, Officer Miller," a young aide said, leading him through marble hallways decorated with portraits of past governors. Miller noticed that Governor Thompson was the first black governor in all those paintings, a fact that now seemed especially significant. The governor's office door opened at exactly 9 a.m. To Miller's surprise, Governor Thompson was indeed wearing the same casual clothes from yesterday, the old sweater, faded jeans, and worn sneakers. But somehow, sitting behind the grand desk of the governor's office, he looked no less powerful or commanding. "Good morning, Officer Miller," Thompson said, gesturing to a chair. "Please, sit down." On his desk, a laptop was open, showing the body camera footage from the previous evening. Miller sat stiffly, his police cap held tightly in his hands. "Sir, I want to apologize." "Not yet," Thompson interrupted, raising his hand. "First, we're going to watch this footage together. I want you to see what I see, what countless others see when they watch interactions like this." For the next 20 minutes, they watched the incident unfold from Miller's body camera perspective. The governor occasionally paused the video to point things out. The immediate suspicion in Miller's voice, the assumptions in his questions, the escalation that had no real cause. "Now," Thompson said after the video ended, "I want you to tell me what you saw when you first noticed me on that street. Be honest. This isn't about being politically correct. I want the truth." Miller swallowed hard, his mouth dry. I saw. Someone who didn't belong there. Someone who didn't fit the neighborhood. And what does belong look like, Officer Miller? Thompson asked quietly. 20 years ago, when I first moved into that neighborhood as a state senator, people said the same thing about me, even in my expensive suits. My children faced the same suspicions at their school. My wife got the same looks at the local grocery store. Tears formed in Miller's eyes, surprising him. In 20 years of police work, he had never cried on duty. I'm sorry, sir. I know those words aren't enough, but I am truly sorry. You're right. Words aren't enough, Thompson agreed. But actions can be. That's why I'm not calling for your badge, Officer Miller. Instead, I'm giving you an assignment. Miller looked up, confused. The governor pressed a button on his desk phone. Send them in, please. The office door opened, and 3 people walked in, a middle-aged black woman, a young Hispanic man, and an elderly Asian gentleman. These are community leaders from different neighborhoods in our city, Thompson explained. For the next 6 months, you'll be working with them, not as a police officer, but as a student. I don't understand, Miller said. You'll spend 2 weeks living in each of their communities, Thompson continued. You'll attend their community meetings, eat at their dinner tables, and most importantly, listen to their stories. You'll learn what it feels like to be seen as an outsider, to be judged before you speak a single word. The governor stood up, still in his casual clothes that had sparked this whole incident. This isn't punishment, Officer Miller. This is an opportunity to see the world through different eyes, to understand the weight of assumptions and the power of prejudice. The question is, are you willing to learn? Miller looked at the community leaders, then back at the governor. For the first time in his career, he was being asked not to act, not to enforce, but to listen and learn, and somehow, that seemed like the most challenging assignment he had ever received. 2 weeks into his new assignment, Officer Miller found himself sitting in Mrs. Jackson's small kitchen in the east side of the city. The elderly woman, one of the community leaders chosen by Governor Thompson, stirred a pot of soup while sharing stories about her 50 years in the neighborhood. You see that corner store across the street? Mrs. Jackson pointed through her window. My late husband built that store with his own hands in 1975. The police used to stop by every day, not to protect it, but to make sure we weren't causing trouble. Now, what kind of trouble did they think 2 hardworking people trying to feed their family could cause? Miller stared into his coffee cup, remembering how many times he had made similar assumptions during his patrols. The steam rising from the cup couldn't hide the shame on his face. I'm not telling you this to make you feel bad, James, Mrs. Jackson said, using his first name as she had insisted from day one. I'm telling you because that store put 3 children through college. One's a doctor now, one's a teacher, and one's working in the governor's office. People just needed to give us a chance. Outside, children played basketball in the street, moving their game whenever cars needed to pass. Miller had once seen such gatherings as potential trouble. Now, after 12 days in the neighborhood, he recognized most of the kids by name and had even joined their game once, though his basketball skills had made them laugh. His phone buzzed, another news outlet requesting an interview. The story of his encounter with Governor Thompson had gone national, but instead of hiding from it, the governor had turned it into a public conversation about police reform and community relations. Mrs. Jackson, Miller said, putting his phone away, how do you do it? How do you not feel angry all the time about the way you were treated? The old woman turned from her soup, her face serious but kind. Who says I'm not angry? But anger can do 2 things, James. It can burn everything down, or it can fuel change. I chose the second option a long time ago. Later that evening, Miller attended a community meeting at the local church. Unlike his previous visits to this neighborhood in his patrol car, he wore civilian clothes and sat quietly in the back, listening. People discussed their challenges, underfunded schools, limited job opportunities, and yes, their complicated relationship with law enforcement. A young man stood up to speak, his voice shaking with emotion. My son is 10 years old. Every day, I have to teach him how to act if police stop him. Not if, but when. What to say, how to move, where to keep his hands. No child should have to learn that kind of fear. Miller felt eyes turned to him. His presence at these meetings was well known by now, but instead of hostility, he saw something different, hope. hoped that maybe his presence meant something was finally changing. After the meeting, Miller walked with Mrs. Jackson back to her house. The streetlights cast long shadows, and he remembered how different this same scene had looked from behind his patrol car window. "You're quiet tonight," Mrs. Jackson observed. "I'm thinking about my daughter," Miller replied. "She's 8. I've never had to teach her to be afraid of the police. I've never had to teach her to be afraid of anything. And now I understand. That's not just protection, that's privilege." Mrs. Jackson stopped walking and turned to face him. "Now you're starting to see. That's what Governor Thompson wanted. Not to shame you, not to punish you, but to help you see." As they reached her house, Miller noticed the corner store was still open, its lights bright against the evening sky. Through the window, he could see Mrs. Jackson's youngest grandson working the register, a college textbook open beside him. "Tomorrow," Mrs. Jackson said as she unlocked her door, "I'll tell you about the summer of 1980, when this whole block came together to save that store during the economic crisis. It's important you understand, Officer Miller, that the real story of our community isn't about survival, it's about strength." Miller nodded, knowing that with each story, each conversation, and each day in this neighborhood, his 20 years of assumptions were slowly being replaced by something much more valuable: truth. 4 months into his special assignment, Officer Miller sat in the busy Hispanic Community Center with Carlos Rodriguez, the young community leader who had been in Governor Thompson's office that day. The center buzzed with activity as people came for English classes, job training, and legal advice. Before this, Miller said, watching a group of children practice traditional dances, "I used to drive past this place and think it was just a gathering spot for troublemakers." He shook his head at his old assumptions. "I never knew about all the programs, the help you provide, the lives you change." Carlos smiled, but his eyes held old pain. "That's the problem, isn't it? People see what they expect to see. When I was growing up, every time police drove by, my mother would pull me inside, even if I was just playing soccer with friends. She was afraid one misunderstanding could change my whole life." Miller thought about the dozens of times he had stopped young Hispanic men for what he had called routine checks. How many dreams had he interrupted? How many lives had he made harder with his unfounded suspicions? A commotion at the front desk caught their attention. A young woman was crying, speaking rapid Spanish. Her son, about 12 years old, tried to translate but struggled with the legal terms. Miller watched as Carlos quickly walked over to help. "Her landlord is trying to evict her illegally," Carlos explained when he returned. "She works 2 jobs, never missed a rent payment, but he wants to raise the rent beyond what the law allows. He thinks she won't know her rights or fight back." "Can you help her?" Miller asked, surprised by how much he cared about the answer. "We will. That's what this place is about, helping people stand up for their rights, teaching them they don't have to be afraid." Carlos looked at Miller thoughtfully. "You know, that's what Governor Thompson is trying to do too, but on a bigger scale." Later that afternoon, Miller attended a police community forum at the center. But this time, instead of standing guard at the door as he would have done months ago, he sat with the residents. He listened as they shared stories of feeling targeted, of living in fear of those who were supposed to protect them. When it was his turn to speak, Miller stood up slowly. The room went quiet. Everyone knew who he was, knew about his encounter with the governor. But they also knew he had been living among them, learning their stories, sharing their meals. "I've been a police officer for 20 years, he began, his voice steady but humble. "I thought I knew this community because I patrolled these streets. But I never really saw you. I saw what my prejudices told me to see. I missed the strength, the dignity, the dreams that build this community every day." An old man in the back raised his hand. "What will you do differently when you go back to patrol?" Miller looked at Carlos before answering. "Everything. I'll do everything differently. Because now I know that every person I stop is someone's child, someone's parent, someone's hope for the future. They're not suspicious until proven innocent. They're human beings deserving of respect and dignity." After the forum, Carlos and Miller walked through the neighborhood. The evening air was filled with the smell of cooking from various restaurants, music from open windows, and the sound of children playing in the courtyards. "You've changed," Carlos observed. "When we first met in the governor's office, you couldn't even look at us. Now you're asking questions, listening to answers, seeing people instead of stereotypes." Miller stopped walking and looked around the vibrant street. You know what the hardest part is? Realizing that everything I need to learn has been here all along. I just wasn't willing to see it. A police car drove by slowly, and Miller noticed how some people instinctively stepped back, how mothers pulled their children closer. Carlos saw him watching. Change takes time, Carlos said, but it has to start somewhere. Governor Thompson knew that when he gave you this assignment. The question is, what will you do with everything you've learned when you go back to wearing that uniform? Miller watched the police car disappear around the corner, knowing that soon he would be back in one himself. But this time, he would see his community through very different eyes. 5 months into his assignment, Miller spent his final community rotation with Mr. Chen, the elderly Asian community leader. They sat in a small tea shop in the heart of the city's Asian district, where the sweet smell of fresh pastries mixed with the aroma of traditional herbs and teas. You look troubled today, Officer Miller, Mr. Chen said, carefully pouring tea into small ceramic cups. Steam rose between them like thoughts taking shape in the air. Miller nodded, watching people pass by through the shop's window. I'm going back to regular duty next month. The governor's office called yesterday to confirm it. And this worries you? Mr. Chen asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. When I first started this assignment, I thought it was a punishment, Miller admitted, wrapping his hands around the warm cup. Now I'm afraid of going back, afraid I'll slip into old habits, afraid I'll forget everything I've learned. Mr. Chen smiled gently. Let me tell you a story. During the COVID pandemic, many people blamed our community for the virus. My grandson, who was born here, came home from school crying because children called him names. Even adults would cross the street to avoid walking near us. Miller shifted uncomfortably, remembering how he had done extra patrols in this neighborhood during that time, assuming there would be more crime. But something interesting happened, Mr. Chen continued. Other communities stood with us. Mrs. Jackson's church group brought food to elderly residents who were afraid to go out. Carlos's community center offered free legal help when businesses were vandalized. Governor Thompson, who was a senator then, spoke out against the hatred. A group of young students entered the tea shop, laughing and talking in a mix of English and Chinese. Miller noticed how they quieted slightly when they saw him, even though he wasn't in uniform. You see their reaction? Mr. Chen asked. That fear doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from experience. From generations of being seen as perpetual foreigners in their own country. How do I change that? Miller asked. How do I help them feel safe instead of afraid? By remembering this moment, Mr. Chen said firmly. By remembering how it feels to be the one who causes fear just by being present. Take that knowledge back with you when you return to duty. Later that evening, Miller attended a community safety meeting at the local cultural center. Unlike the previous meetings, this one was different. Governor Thompson himself was there, still wearing his casual clothes that had started this whole journey. The governor noticed Miller and walked over. How are the lessons going, Officer Miller? Life-changing, sir, Miller replied honestly. But I'm worried about going back, about facing my old colleagues, my old habits. Governor Thompson smiled. That's exactly why I chose these 3 communities for your assignment. Mrs. Jackson taught you about resilience through history. Carlos showed you the power of community support. And Mr. Chen is teaching you about facing fear and prejudice with dignity. But how do I take all this back to the force? Miller asked. You'll have help, the governor replied. Starting next month, we're launching a new police training program. Every officer will spend time living in different communities, just like you have. And guess who's going to help lead it? Miller's eyes widened. Me, sir? Who better? Thompson said. You've lived this journey. You've seen both sides. Your experience can help other officers understand what I understood that evening on Cedar Avenue. That real change happens when we stop seeing each other as stereotypes and start seeing each other as human beings. As the meeting began, Miller looked around the room. He saw faces that had become familiar over the past months. People whose stories he now knew, whose lives had become intertwined with his own. He realized that Governor Thompson hadn't just taught him about prejudice, he taught him about redemption, about the possibility of change, and about the power of seeing people for who they really are. The governor stood to address the crowd, and Miller noticed something new in his own reaction. Instead of seeing authority or power, He simply saw a man who had chosen to turn a moment of prejudice into an opportunity for transformation. 1 year had passed since that fateful evening on Cedar Avenue. Officer James Miller stood in front of a packed auditorium at the police academy, facing a new class of recruits. Behind him, on a large screen, played the body camera footage of his encounter with Governor Thompson. "This video," Miller said, his voice carrying through the silent room, "shows the worst and best moment of my career. The worst because it shows who I was, an officer who let prejudice guide his actions. The best because it led to who I am today." In the front row sat Mrs. Jackson, Carlos Rodriguez, and Mr. Chen, who had become regular speakers at these training sessions. Next to them sat Governor Thompson, still wearing his famous old sweater, though it had become something of a symbol now. "When I put those handcuffs on Governor Thompson that day," Miller continued, "I thought I was losing everything. My job, my reputation, my dignity. Instead, I gained something much more valuable: understanding." He clicked to the next slide, showing pictures from his 6-month journey through the communities. There he was playing basketball with kids in Mrs. Jackson's neighborhood, helping at Carlos's community center, sharing tea with Mr. Chen. The governor could have fired me. He could have made an example of me. Instead, he showed me what real leadership looks like. He turned my mistake into a movement. Miller wasn't exaggerating. The program that had started with him had now expanded across the state. Over 300 officers had completed community immersion training, living and learning in different neighborhoods. Civilian complaints had dropped by 40% in participating precincts. But the real change, Miller said, gesturing to the community leaders, happens when we stop seeing neighborhoods as problems to solve and start seeing them as communities to serve. When we understand that every person we interact with has a story, a family, a dream. A young recruit raised her hand. "How you handle other officers who haven't gone through this training? Who still hold the old attitudes?" Miller smiled, remembering how he had asked a similar question. "By being an example. By speaking up when we see bias. By remembering that change starts with one person, one interaction at a time." After the session, Governor Thompson approached Miller. A news crew was setting up for an interview about the program's 1-year anniversary. "Ready for the cameras, Officer Miller?" Thompson asked. Miller straightened his uniform. "You know, sir, a year ago I would have rather faced an armed suspect than a news crew. Now I welcome these interviews. They're a chance to show others what's possible." The governor nodded approvingly. "You've come a long way from Cedar Avenue." "Thanks to you, sir." "No," Thompson corrected him. "Thanks to yourself. I just opened the door. You chose to walk through it." As they prepared for the interview, Miller saw his daughter in the audience. She was wearing a Junior Police Academy t-shirt, her face beaming with pride. Next to her sat Carlos's son and Mr. Chen's grandson, all 3 children chatting and laughing together. "You see that?" Mrs. Jackson said, following his gaze. "That's real change. Not just policies and programs, but people connecting, children growing up without the fears we had." The reporter signaled they were ready to begin. Governor Thompson took his place beside Miller, both men standing tall. "One last thing," Miller said quietly before the cameras started rolling. "I never properly thanked you for wearing those old clothes that day, for taking that walk in our neighborhood." The governor smiled. "Sometimes the most important lessons come when we least expect them, Officer Miller. The question is whether we're willing to learn from them." As the cameras began rolling, Miller looked out at the faces in the audience, the recruits who would shape the future of policing, the community leaders who had become his teachers, and the children who represented hope for a better tomorrow. He realized that his story hadn't ended that night on Cedar Avenue. It had only just begun.